dropped it in a bucket, touchdown!
Becker transition three, bang!
He's bends it like Beckham. Are you kidding?
Hello and welcome back for episode 42 of White Noise Sports with Tanner White and the first episode of the new year. I already said all the holiday pleasantries and I've never been one for resolutions, so I'll spare you. Last week was Fantasy Football Friday number 10, and this week will be the very last one for the year. Of course, we'll think more about players resting, eliminated versus still alive teams in the playoff races, little bit about injuries, all of it. It's the last week of the fantasy season, so we'll go hard. We're also taking on the NBA's three-point shooting environment and parity, hearing what the almighty commissioner Adam Silver had to say, and then we'll be out of here. Of course, fantasy football's got to be number one on the list this week, and this is Fantasy Football Friday number 11. You better be playing for a championship because you've been taking the tips from the show all season long, right? I think next year I'll start fantasy coverage shortly before most leagues draft in August-ish and try and put something out on it every single week. Maybe condense it and just kind of rapid fire some more top matchups as I see them. For the all-important fantasy decisions this week, where do I even start, honestly? How many times do I have to say this, though? I love desperate teams. I think that's really going to come out this week. Some of these desperate teams have been playing really poorly and with injuries or just had bad game scripts that aren't really conducive to good fantasy results. The Falcons and Steelers are good examples. The Buccaneers and Broncos. You should probably trust most of the skill position players from all of those teams, except for Kyle Pitts with the Falcons. Please don't ever trust Kyle Pitts. Resting is going to be really the talk of the whole league this week. Josh Allen is going to rest. Pat Mahomes is going to rest. Jalen Hurts was hurt but probably wouldn't have played anyway. Matthew Stafford. A lot of good players that have no incentive to go out there this week, week 18. Just because their playoff seeds are already locked in. You might have heard that Saquon Barkley is over 2,000 rushing yards. He needs 101 yards against, of all teams, his old team, the New York Giants. And they toyed with the idea of letting Saquon play for a while, but they finally announced this Wednesday that that idea was a no-go. That is a shame, and he's going to fall a little bit short of the all-time season rushing record. The only good news about all this resting of starters, it creates new opportunities. Carson Wentz is the Chiefs' backup quarterback. I would actually 100% trust him in my lineups. He's got a career touchdown to interception ratio of about 2.3. He's over 22,000 career yards and has plenty of years as a starter. He's one of the most experienced backups in the league. I really like the Chiefs' number 2 tight end, Noah Gray, too. He's already had some games this year where he was one of the offensive stars, and he plays behind Travis Kelce. That's pretty impressive. The Bills are likely starting Mitchell Trubisky. If Josh Allen does play at all, the rumor is that it's going to be, but for a handful of series maybe. And Mitchell Trubisky is a little bit less accomplished than Carson Wentz, but he actually has some rushing upside. In his best year with the Bears, he ran for over 400 yards and 3 touchdowns on only about 70 carries. I don't believe in the Eagles' backup quarterback, Kenny Pickett, even though he put up some pretty good numbers last week against the Cowboys. And it's definitely a wait and see with the Texans, who can't move up from the number 4 spot, but they haven't announced that they're going to sit any of their starters yet. It's something to think about. If you're like me and you have their kind of borderline Pro Bowl running back Joe Mixon, you're still kind of in limbo, but mostly you're leaning towards not being able to play him because they shouldn't play their starters for very long. If the Texans don't start C.J. Stroud, then do not look to their backup quarterback Davis Mills if you want to avoid misery. Jimmy Garoppolo is going to start for the Rams in place of Matthew Stafford. He just hasn't played a snap this whole year, and I don't think I can recommend him. Plus the Seahawks defense, who the Rams will be playing, they've actually scored 16 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 7 weeks. Now, for one of the most influential guys in all of fantasy, as he so often is, Tua Tagovailoa. I would love to know if he's going to be available to play, but I don't think anybody knows that yet. The Dolphins are mathematically still alive, and right now, for Sunday, they're planning to start their backup quarterback Tyler Huntley. Tua didn't play last week with a hip injury. If he's unable to play this week too, you really kind of have to downgrade everybody on the Dolphins at least a little bit. I could simplify the entire issue of who's playing, who's resting, who has nothing to play for even further too. I'll try and do that here. There are only 2 total playoff spots up for grabs, and that looks like this. In the AFC, the number 7 seed will either be the Broncos, Dolphins, or the Bengals. In the NFC, the 4 seed is the only open spot, and it'll either be the Buccaneers or the Falcons. You should be really excited about every major offensive contributor on all of those teams I just listed, because they should be in some high-scoring, dramatic games that are pretty close, where everybody's battling for their lives, and they'll probably take some big gambles. Some teams will be looking to play spoiler, like the Jets and the Panthers, and those teams have some good offensive options too. Adam Thielen and Davante Adams are 2 of the oldest receivers in the league. They're 34 and 32 respectively, and they're also on fire. Don't keep either of them on the bench if you have any choice. Thielen has a very soft matchup with a not good Bucs secondary, and he just dropped a 30 bomb last week in fantasy. Davante Adams has a much worse matchup on paper against the Dolphins, but I don't know how much this scares me. The Dolphins are 3rd in total defense. They've only given up 18 passing touchdowns in 16 weeks. But do you remember the stat I gave you last week? Aaron Rodgers still needs 1 more touchdown for 500 in his career. And if this is his last NFL game, as he and many others have speculated it could be, I will almost guarantee you that he forces a touchdown to Davante. No one else has caught more from Aaron for their careers or meant more to him personally. Plus, Garrett Wilson continues to be one of the best number 2 receivers in the league, and he draws plenty of coverage away. I hope this game is a shootout for so many different reasons between the Jets and the Dolphins, most of them fantasy related. Everybody knows how much I love the Dolphins tight end Jonnu Smith by this point. He's tight end 4 in the league, and if Tua plays, I think everyone in this game is a good fantasy option, even with 2 very good on-paper defenses. In one great stroke of irony, though, I do want to touch a little bit on kicking and defenses in fantasy, because I just had by far my worst week of the season in the first week of my championship about that. Things that I want to reiterate when considering matchups of both kickers and defenses. For kickers first, the weather. There are way too many good kickers that are just held back by being in tough environments. The Steelers' Chris Boswell continues to be kicker number 1 in the league. He is just a million miles better than anybody else at handling those elements and can still make, 45, 50-yarders consistently all the time, no matter what he's facing. Tons of other kickers just aren't built like that. When you see a guy that's playing in a really bad weather game, whether it's just wind, rain, whether it's a blizzard, you have to be wary of the kicker. Teams go for it on 4th down essentially more than ever. If they don't have a ton of confidence in that guy that he's going to drill it, they probably will just pass up field goal attempts for the most part. Kind of the reverse of this is also true. Kickers that play in domes, if those guys are playing at home, yeah, those are really good starts. I still say the Cowboys' Brandon Aubrey is the best in the whole league. His accuracy has tailed off a little bit in the second half of the season, but he's second in attempts, I believe, to Chris Boswell, probably second in makes as well, and I know that he's tied for second in scoring in the league. When it comes to defenses for this week, I cannot lie, it's going to be utter misery. You're going to have to close your eyes, throw a dart. I was guilty last week of trusting the Colts defense against the Giants, and they got nuked by Drew Lock. Drew Lock, of all people, put up over 350 yards, 5 total touchdowns on that Colts defense, and they went for -4 points in fantasy. Some backup quarterback somewhere this week is going to go off against a team that he shouldn't. And some starting caliber defense typically is going to really struggle against somebody else's backups. I wish I knew who was which and exactly which teams we could rely on, but I just don't. If I did, I would be in a better position in both of my fantasy leagues, but I do not. Again, I have to make a bit of a recommendation about weather. Better weather games almost always mean more offensive production. That's not a perfectly hard and fast rule, but it is more likely than not going to hold true. Anybody who plays outside probably assume that they're going to have, if they're at home, a bit of a lower scoring game. Anybody who plays in a dome or just in a generally warm climate will tend to have higher scoring games. Of course, as fantasy managers, we typically love higher scoring games, but be aware that your defense then, if they're playing in that game, could have a tendency to get nuked a little bit. You know what I mean? Does that answer all of your fantasy questions for this year? Look, I hope so. I've tried. I hope anybody who's taken even a single one of the tips I've laid out and had some practical way to apply it has benefited. I wouldn't give a tip if it weren't something that I were already doing in one of my leagues, or at least planning on doing. I'm not an expert. I don't keep these extensive spreadsheets of every player's recent performances and find all of the mathematical best matchups. I am a guy that understands football, I think, and the current state of the NFL. And I'd like to not just get better at playing fantasy every year, but also to help everyone else enjoy it at kind of my same level and to get better at it themselves, of course. I'll give the results of my playoff matchups next week, and then we'll be done with fantasy, like I say, until August or so when it's time to draft. It has been a ride, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. Now on to the NBA's three-point shooting environment. This is kind of a fun and new one for me. When you see this playing out in front of your eyes, especially more so as a casual fan, I think it's easy to miss, but I'm guessing that more advanced numbers and more data on it in sort of the quote-unquote modern offensive environment, it will be pretty clear. There were two statistically shocking games that made me want to get into this, which saw the same two teams miss the most combined three-pointers in league history for a single game. The Bulls and Hornets pulled off this exact dubious quote-unquote honor in about a 2-week span, and that seems a tad unacceptable to me. The number that they had to quote-unquote beat for combined missed threes was 75 after the game between them on December 13th. Now that was a Friday the 13th, right? How much did that factor in? Who's to say? Food for thought there. However, that is a ton of misses. The numbers for each side were equally offensive to good basketball. The Hornets shot 8 of 46 or 17% from 3, and the Bulls a tad better at 14 of 51 or about 27%. I have to imagine that that's the kind of percentage that teams were shooting when the three-point line was introduced for the first time, because come on, right? To then repeat that the next time they match up with 75 combined misses, it has to be some astronomical odds, the exact same number, but they did it again on December 30th. Now, neither of these are good teams. That's not news. The Bulls being 15 and 18 and the Hornets being a lowly 7 and 26 as I'm recording. But if it were an individual player shooting like that, can you imagine how quickly he would get cut? Especially if it's somebody who's meant to be a wing shooter and shoot them at high volumes. The question everybody's asking now, in light of this shameful shooting display, does the NBA need to change the rules to disincentivize three-point shooting? I add some writers onto that too. Do they need to move the three-point line back a little bit? Is everybody running the same offense and making games look more boring? Let's crack this all open. So Adam Silver, he looks like a werewolf. No, I'm sorry, that's an intrusive thought. He's the NBA commissioner, and he's under contract through the 2029-30 season. I wish the financials on that deal were available, but alas, they are not. Silver's been asked these questions before. He actually had to address all the cameras and the microphones during the NBA Cup, and he admitted that the league has a problem and that he was going to at least set the ball rolling for some sort of investigation. Truth be told, to start off with, I like the idea of moving the three-point line back. It's currently 22 feet from the corners and 23 foot 9 inches from straight on to the center of the rim. That's how they measure that distance. I'm really not opposed to the league playing next year with that all moved back by, let's say, 2 feet all around. My guess is it wouldn't really affect the number of three-point attempts, but I think it would dramatically affect the shooting percentage around the league, especially for already great shooters who have these perfect mechanics and they're so robotically in tune with the distance that they need for their shot. Of course, total three-point attempts should go down. I think there would be maybe an even bigger emphasis on shooting from the corners. Hopefully more touches in the post per possession. And then from there, does that hopefully give us a return to some stronger and heavier post players? Maybe even bring the center position back? Call it primordial basketball, but I would enjoy all of that. In that interview with Silver during the NBA Cup, he gave a really good politician's answer by also saying that the issue isn't just about shooting threes. This was a great quote from that interview. I would not reduce it to a so-called three-point shooting issue. I think we look more holistically at the skill level on the floor, the diversity of offense, the fan reception to the game, all of the above. I really have to tip my cap to him. If there is a smarter person running a professional sports league in the world, then I don't think I've heard of him. I'm certain that offenses have become less diverse. Of course, I think the Warriors have to shoulder some of that blame, but they also had 11 years of the best shooting tandem ever with Steph and Klay Thompson. It begs the question, what else were they supposed to do? Now I think that the Celtics are, for the most part, the model that everyone else is striving to imitate. They're on pace to be the first team ever to average 50 attempts from three per game. That used to be an incredibly aberrant number that would only really happen in big blowouts when one side had to chuck it up early in every possession. The Cavaliers continue to be the best team in the league. They also continue to be the league's best three-point shooting team. They're over 40% for the year, and they're fifth in attempts per game right now. So are they also kind of emblematic of the problem? Did they in any way kind of borrow Boston's championship game plan? It's tough to say. I just think this year's Cavs are fantastic and they're loaded all around. Now, when we circle back to reality a little bit more, you can't make any major rule changes in season. But I say go ahead and try something, even multiple things for next year. Start off all of these things in the preseason. Get all the data that you can from there and publish it right as the regular season is set to tip off. Then let it ride for, say 2 years minimum and continue to just collect numbers and eventually make a final vote on keeping it permanently. You feel me? So that's everything I have for the week. I did indeed get my grades back and 4-pointed my second term in my master's. The dream is alive. I'm just about ready to start that gig with an arena soccer team. You know me, I'll do a little bit of anything. As always, whatever else catches my eye is always on the table. Remember, you can feel free to hit me on my socials if you have an idea for me. Instagram and TikTok at The Voice of Tanner. Connect on LinkedIn. And yes, of course, I hope that your new year is happy and prosperous and whatnot. And finally, we got a new intro-outro for you. I had dragged my feet on it a little bit, and I liked the one I had been using. I really liked spelling out ridiculous, and I thought that was one of my favorite calls this year, but it's just time for a change sometimes. This has been episode 42 of White Noise Sports with Tanner White. Thanks for joining me.
Yates! He dropped it in a bucket. Touchdown!
Becker transition three, bang!
He's bends it like Beckham. Are you kidding?